Chapter 12 of The Beautiful Mrs. Davenant by Violet Tweedale. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. Mrs. Davenant at Bay. When the ladies from Little Glentworth walked into the Carltons' library, they found the rest of the party assembled, and a subdued hum of conversation was going on. The family party had been augmented by the arrival of Lady Tadcaster, Mrs. Carlton's sister, and the Halls had brought 2 American guests, Major Griffith and Colonel Lycett. The little party had expanded into 12 persons, and, as was her invariable habit, Mrs. Carlton introduced the last comers to those unknown to them. Claude Carlton had been standing up before the fire, feeling curiously restless until the door opened to admit the last of his guests. It was a fine moonlight night, and he had congratulated himself on the fact, as he looked out a few minutes previously from the windows upon the wide expanse of wooded parklands stretching down to the river. The roads would be good going for Mrs. Davenant's Rolls-Royce. Neither he nor his mother attempted to use the large drawing-room, even when receiving a number of guests. Claude said it looked chilly and unlived in, which in truth it was, and he preferred the spacious, stately proportions and comfortable aspect of the library, with its yawning fireplace, the rich clothing of beautiful bindings lining its walls, giving it that air of completeness nothing can supply so satisfactorily as books. Palms, ferns, azaleas, and camellias in full blow were grouped in dark corners. The room looked beautiful, as even Carlton himself had acknowledged when glancing around him. As he stood up before the blazing logs, waiting for the woman he was impatient to see, the butler announced, "Mrs. Davenant, Miss Howard," and he followed his mother down the room to welcome them. He held Mrs. Davenant's hand, perhaps for a moment longer than was necessary, looking down on her with eyes eloquent in admiration. And she certainly was very good to look upon, with her starry eyes raised to his, her white skin shining like satin against the folds of her dark gown. Then he turned to greet Agnes Howard, brilliantly handsome in dark red velvet. Mrs. Davenant passed down the long room by Mrs. Carlton's side with that perfect grace and composure which characterized all her movements, shaking hands first with one, then another of her acquaintances. "I want to introduce to you Colonel Lycett and Major Griffith," said Mrs. Carlton. Both men bowed low, and as they held out their hands they said, "Very pleased to meet you." "Very pleased to meet you." A close observer might have noticed that on hearing this mode of address Mrs. Davenant paused involuntarily and looked more attentively at both men, but Mrs. Carlton was saying, "Now I want you to know my sister," and the 2 ladies passed on together. Lady Tadcaster greeted Mrs. Davenant with great cordiality. She was a widow of importance in her world, owning the unique reputation for never having compromised herself. The truth was that, being very plain, no one would believe anything against her. Her female relations were always extremely affectionate to her, as her lord had left her the family pearls, and the power to will them to whom she pleased. It was maliciously said that she devoted herself to French novels and being rude to her relatives, but to the Carltons, mother and son, she was devoted, and she had contrived to reach Great Glentworth the night before, at her sister's earnest request. "Well, how do you like settling down in the country?" she asked pleasantly, as she and Mrs. Davenant seated themselves side by side. "Oh, immensely. So far it's been a great rest cure." Lady Tadcaster smiled wryly. "I can't say I've ever found that, because people insist on going to town to be amused, and going down to the country to be amusing. Town birds feel it incumbent upon them to disperse agricultural depression," supplemented Captain Hall, who had drawn a chair to their side, looking very much at home in his well-worn pink. "Personally, I find rest and oblivion in a crowd," declared Tadcaster, "and more especially if it's a musical crowd, where everyone talks at once and no one ever says anything. I found the peace season the hardest I ever went through. We were always told that after the war everything would be different. Naturally, we thought that meant things would be quieter and more subdued. The difference I found was in the wildly reckless expenditure, the wild desire for amusement of all sorts, and the prices willingly paid for all luxuries. The gulf between society and labour was never more pronounced. The harder labour struck, the harder society jazzed and raced.
Sadie says it reminds her of the insane spending of the San Franciscans when their insurance money was paid after the earthquake, remarked the master.
"Come and have some dinner, Aunt Clara," said Carlton, offering his arm. Captain Hall led in Mrs. Davenant, who found herself next to one of the Americans at the round table. Mrs. Carlton faced her, with Lester and Warburton on her right and left. The master was in first-rate form.
"I'm in luck tonight," he told himself with a quiet chuckle,
as he turned a beaming face on his companion.
"I say, what an awfully pretty frock you've got on. You don't mind my saying so, do you? What's it made of?"
"Satin brocade," answered Hilda. "I'm glad it meets with your approval."
"Suits you down to the ground," he declared,
surveying the dark blue and gold triumph of a French artiste. She coloured slightly under his too obvious appreciation of her beauty, and indeed he thought her wonderfully attractive and lovely.
"I didn't dare hope I'd find myself seated next to you," he half whispered. "What a thing it is in life to be sure to find someone who never palls."
Mrs. Davenant laughed outright. "We hardly see enough of each other to tire, if such a thing were possible. How well your wife looks tonight." The master pulled himself up and took the hint, glancing round at Sadie, who sat on one side of her host. She wore a white satin sheath that showed off her smart little figure. Diamonds sparkled in her hair and on her breast, where a knot of weird-looking orchids clustered.
"Yes, I suppose she is what one would call a smart-looking little lady," he conceded. "She's a rattling good sort, too. Couldn't bear to be henpecked."
"Don't you think it entirely depends upon the hen?" suggested Hilda, with a gleam of mischief.
Hall grinned. "Perhaps it does," he conceded. "What's so clever about Sadie is that she quite understands that to look pretty very nearly means I am pretty. I never cared much for big women. They look too much as if they could take care of themselves. That chap who took her in is a first-rate rider. He's got no end of trotters and chasers on his place in Virginia."
"An American?" inquired Mrs. Davenant casually. "I didn't catch his name when he was introduced."
"Lycett, Colonel Lycett. His town house is in Washington. He and Major Griffith only arrived this afternoon, so he brought them along. Good chaps, both of them. Don't tell you they won the war and can cut off your bacon with a stroke of the pen."
"Old friends of Mrs. Hall's?" suggested Hilda. The master shook his head.
"No, they brought letters from friends of hers, so we asked them down here for a few days."
Colonel Lycett was a tall, wiry, grey-haired man of about 50, clean-shaven and admirably groomed. Griffith was also clean-shaven. He was the clear-cut, fine-featured type which is now so essentially American. He was seated on Mrs. Davenant's left, but so far he was immersed in conversation with Emily Warburton, and she could not see him distinctly. Lady Tadcaster was chattering with Carlton.
"Griffith's got all sorts of rum opinions," whispered Hall, under cover of the buzz of conversation.
"What sort of rum opinions?" whispered back Hilda, suddenly interested.
"Oh, extraordinary opinions as to our having lived in a previous existence and astral bodies. I don't suppose you know what they mean any more than I do."
He glanced across the table with a little laugh.
"Did you ever sit at a dinner table where they managed to keep off it?" he asked.
Mrs. Carlton was talking volubly and leaning forward as she addressed Major Griffith.
"No, we haven't a ghost here, but there's said to be a good one in the neighbourhood."
The whole table suddenly paused to listen.
"Where's that, Sybil?" asked Lady Tadcaster. "The Lake House, old Mr. Thorpe's place."
"Thorpe?
Thorpe. I once knew a Thorpe in Washington who owned a place in England called the Lake House," broke in Major Griffith abruptly.
"It was probably the same eccentric individual who lives near here," observed Mrs. Davenant, smiling suddenly round at him. Griffith shook his head.
"No, the man I mean is dead, and a good job too. He was an out-and-out rascal." "But what about the Lake House ghost?" broke in Colonel Lycett impatiently. "Oh, no one seems to know very much about it," laughed Carlton. "Mrs. Davenant proposed to investigate it. I don't know if she has made any progress."
"Keen as I am, I'm afraid I've made none," she answered. "I've never even passed the threshold." She met the stern blue eyes of Lycett and held them for a moment, and then Griffith again claimed her attention eagerly.
"I'm so glad to find so many British are keen," he exclaimed. "I wish you'd come over to us and put a little enthusiasm into Washington. We're all off on the wrong track there, but perhaps you know Washington already?"
"I've been there," replied Mrs. Davenant, "but many years ago. I cannot find out what is supposed to haunt the lake house. No one seems to know."
"How clever," thought Lester, as he listened intently. "She steered him clean off Washington, and she's never turned a hair."
As Mrs. Davenant confessed to having been in that city, his eye had instinctively turned to Carlton, who was also listening. They had exchanged glances which were more hostile than friendly. Carlton's expression conveyed a contemptuous indifference to any proof, however strong or slender, against Mrs. Davenant's fair name. Warburton had now joined in the conversation raging around ghosts, and the Americans evidently regarded him, for a parson, as rather an amazing proposition. "First you must prove that the so-called dead actually leave us," he quietly remarked to Lady Tadcaster.
"What a very unpleasant suggestion," she retorted.
Warburton looked at her with perfect gravity, taking no note of the laughter echoing round the table. "You'll agree, Lady Tadcaster, that I'm not here to minister to bodies, but to souls. Would you make me out a disbeliever in the object to which I am professed? If souls do not exist in a post-mortem state, then my labour is in vain. There is no sense in my ministry." He spoke smilingly, but all could see that he was absolutely sincere.
"Our contention was not that souls cease to exist after death, but that they do not return to earth," insisted Lady Tadcaster. "We have no proof that they do return."
"We have no proof that they do not return," mildly insisted Warburton. In the general laugh which followed the little duel, the conversation drifted off into other subjects. A sudden constraint had fallen upon Mrs. Davenant, and she sat in dreamy silence, only half listening to the light little stream of remarks the master trickled into her ear. She felt as if she had received warning to guard the secrets of her life even more closely than before. "Yet if they knew every detail, would I really care?" she asked herself in a weary disdain. "Is there one exception that I dread?" She glanced involuntarily at Carlton, and their eyes met. He smiled at her, and she felt she needs must smile again. Yet a thrill of apprehension ran through her. How unmistakable was that proud faith in his glance! He had heard something, and yet he trusted her. What had he heard? When the women once more found themselves in the library, Hilda left Mrs. Carlton and Lady Tadcaster talking to the others by the fire, while she moved over to a sofa and seated herself by Emily Warburton. She had no desire to be drawn into the conversation which had reverted back to ghosts. Every now and again a sentence or two was wafted over to her ears. Mrs. Hall was referring to the vicar.
"It's so bad for a man not to be absolutely normal, don't you think so?"
Hilda and Emily exchanged smiles. "By normal she means absolutely material. Ambrose could never be that," said his sister quietly. The entrance of the men prevented their exploiting the subject further, and Carlton at once drew her to a far corner of the room to show her some old pottery which had just been dug up in a neighbouring field. "How beautiful your room looks to-night," she said, glancing away from him and round its spaciousness. She bent her head over some violets and lifted their heads with her slender finger.
"Will you accept those from me?" he asked.
He lifted a bunch of white violets from a glass and dried their stalks with his handkerchief. She took them at once without a trace of hesitation, and held them for a moment to her face. "How good of you, Major Carlton. Of course I'm delighted to have them. How sweet they do smell." She bent her head and placed them in a fold of her dress, where they lay against her breast, and he stood silently watching her, and thinking how beautiful was the setting of her head upon her lovely shoulders.
"I've not had a word with you yet, and I'm off to-morrow morning," he said, drawing up a chair under a bower of azaleas and throwing himself down by her side. "Will you promise to let me know if you come up to town?"
"Why, certainly," she responded. "Shall we do a play together?"
"Oh, rather. 2 or 3 plays. That'll be ripping. You do promise to come, don't you? I mean, to town."
"Oh, I can't absolutely promise," she replied with a gay little smile. "I hate making plans. I love to act on the spur of the moment. Look upon it as a possibility, but not a certainty." She saw his face fall.
"It was all I had to look forward to,"
he said below his breath, but she caught the words. "When do you return here?" she asked.
"Oh, not for ages. Not till the 2nd week in December. How am I to live without seeing you till then?"
He bent down and looked into her eyes. There was something in his face she had never seen before, a new expression, but she knew the meaning of those tones in his voice. She looked full at him with her soft speaking eyes. Her face was very grave, her voice very kind. "Just as you lived before we ever met. I don't want to lose your friendship, Major Carlton." She rose as she spoke. "I fear you're forgetting your duties as host." He jumped up instantly, and they moved across the room together, and as they passed Lady Tadcaster that lady detained her, and he mingled with his other guests. When the last carriage had driven off, when Mrs. Davenant's motor had rushed away into the silence of the night, Claude Carlton retired to his own private den, and lighting a cigar gave himself up to thought. He had received a rebuff, but he did not acknowledge defeat. Hilda Davenant might imagine him defeated, but he was far from being hopeless. He did not believe in giving in till he was absolutely compelled. It was in the nature of his temperament to be very slow in desire, but once desire was awakened, to be tenacious and fight to the death for what he really wanted. Carlton did what all men will do till the day of judgment. He made up his mind that he had found his mate, and he had no intentions of losing her again. Meanwhile a little family circle conversed softly round the fire in the library. Lady Tadcaster was sipping her 2nd cup of tea and smoking her before-bed cigarette. She spoke decisively and dogmatically. "There's not the faintest doubt as to his infatuation. The matter really resolves itself into this: is she free to marry him, or is she not?" "Oh, you think it's a certainty she will accept him if she is free?" questioned her sister anxiously. "I think it so certain that I made a point of being extremely agreeable, almost affectionate to her. I always am very nice to pretty widows and pretty girls. One never knows who they will become." "I'm not so sure, Clara," chimed in Lester, rubbing his thin hands up and down his long, thin legs. "I'm inclined to think there's an impediment somewhere in the background. I tried to draw Lycett, but found him very uncommunicative. He didn't yield to my blandishments, though I spotted at once he could say a lot if he chose. What's that lady's name? I didn't catch it," he asked, indicating Miss Howard. "Oh, Miss Agnes Howard. She and Mrs. Davenant lived together. I suppose before they came here they lived together in Washington," I answered casually, and watched his face. Even his iron grey mask wasn't proof against the stunning surprise he felt. I caught him glancing at her in a curious puzzled way several times during the evening.
Mrs. Carleton put down her teacup with a little clatter. "Oh, I do so hate all this suspicion and prying," she exclaimed, rubbing up her monocle vigorously. "If only I could be sure that Claudia wouldn't marry her, I wouldn't care a straw what her past life has been. I'd gladly accept her for what she now appears to be, a gentlewoman and a pleasant member of our little country circle."
Lester smiled grimly.
"Of course, we all know that a woman can change her character with her hat. After all, what are most heads? Merely hat pegs. I don't think you'll be kept long in suspense, Sybil. I guess matters will very rapidly come to a head. I have rarely passed so interesting an evening. Women ought to be studied like meteorology. They're a distinct science, and, like the weather, of infinite variety. Claudy and the beautiful Mrs. Davenant, the master trying to avoid his wife's gimlet and making the running on his own account. Poor Warburton and the mysterious Agnes Howard. I really am very lucky. Some people never meet anything interesting. They may found a new faith and lead a forlorn hope without encountering a thrill, whilst I can't even take a taxi to Paddington without encountering matter enough for a shilling shocker. "I never really feel well when nothing's going on," remarked Lady Tadcaster sympathetically. "Men of to-day have a passion for celebrities, a sort of relentless hunting after notoriety. We've got so confused by the war that we're always doing the wrong thing without knowing it, and knowing the right thing without doing it. The worst kind of women are always the most attractive. They take such pains over their nails and their eyebrows." Mrs. Carleton got up hastily. "I'm going to bed. There's cubbing tomorrow morning, and it's just on midnight. Good night, Clara. Lester, you'll see to the lights." Lester closed the door and returned softly to the hearthrug. "Poor Sybil, she's got a rough time before her, I fear," he whispered as he lit a cigarette. Lady Tadcaster shrugged her shoulders and began to hunt for a shoe which had gone astray. "Oh, I don't know. It may come all right. Mrs. Davenant gives me the impression of being self-made, and she's taken a lot of trouble over her work. The really hopeless people are those who have been made by someone else." End of chapter 12.